Steph Curry was the highlight of the night at Madison Square Garden Tuesday, but Knicks fans' minds are just on their team's continued struggles as they deal with a COVID-19 outbreak on top of it. Hello and welcome to the Putback with Ian Begley. Live, I'm Chris Williamson alongside SNY NBA insider Ian Begley. We're joined by two gentlemen who know as much about the Knicks as anyone. Steve Popper is a longtime Knicks reporter and NBA columnist for Newsday, and Jonathan Macri is the dean of Knicks Film Skool. He writes, he hosts a podcast, and obviously he's here with us today. And we're live on SNY's Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube pages, as well as streaming on SNY.tv. And as always, you can get involved in the comments section throughout this entire stream. But as always, we're going to tip things off with the baseline. And Ian, the Knicks have now lost 15 of their last 22 following last night's loss to Steph Curry and the Warriors. They continue to really struggle at home. They continue to struggle on defense. Are you surprised what we're seeing at this point?
I am, just because if you look at this thing in a big picture sense, last year this team had an identity and they brought most of the players back from last year, but you switch things up in the backcourt, you bring in Kemba Walker and Evan Fournier. And the thinking then was what you get offensively from Fournier and Walker will offset anything you lose on defense. That was the calculation, and it hasn't played out that way so far. And listen, it's a long season, but we have a pretty good body of evidence right now about what the Knicks are and the way they play. And it's just not pretty. And it's such a divergent thing from last year. And to me, you look at a 360-degree view of this thing, and it's just not pretty, because not only are they not winning, it's hard to see like an immediate move that is a path forward for them based on where they are with contracts and the roster and all that.
Yeah, it seems like they're really tied up when it comes to that. And Steve, when you look at this team and all the games that you've watched, what do you see as the number one issue behind the Knicks' struggles this season?
Well, I think Ian touched on it. This doesn't look like a Tom Thibodeau team. One of the things that a scout said to me in the offseason when they were making these moves was the hardest thing is to take the next step, to get guys who will buy in, who will be a part of this and not upset the chemistry that was. Look, they weren't the most talented team last year, but they had a chemistry. They all had an identity the way they played. This team doesn't have that. And it's not just the new guys. Julius Randle doesn't seem to have it. RJ Barrett seems lost at times. It just seems like it's not a cohesive unit that fits together. We asked Derrick Rose about this last night, and he said, if I had an answer, I'd scream it. But, he's been with Tom longer than anyone, and he doesn't see an answer to how you make this work right now.
Yeah, and that's very concerning, especially because we're more than a quarter of the way in the season. Obviously, things can change, but right now it doesn't seem like there are really a lot of answers. And Jonathan, how has your optimism level in the Knicks and their future shifted, especially over the last 2 months?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely gone down for this season. And obviously it hasn't worked on the court. And I think Steve just touched on a great point. As someone who roots for a team, you acknowledge that there's only so much a front office could do as far as bringing in talent. I mean, superstars don't grow on trees. But what made Knicks fans very happy last year is that buy-in, that culture was always there. And you had that to fall back on. And it's one thing to lose games. It's another thing to lose games where that kind of foundational piece is no longer there. And that, kind of makes you worried about other things. What are other players around the league thinking? There was a lot of talk last year about guys see what's going on here. They want to be a part of it, this and that. Now, is that still the case? The only thing I'll say is in terms of the long term, I do think there is still optimism about the front office's ability to bring in young players. Obviously, we saw Deuce McBride last night. We've seen Obi. We've seen Quickly, Quentin Grimes. I think that's probably the bright spot at this point. But in terms of this season, I don't know how you look at the last, month and a half and could possibly feel good about where things are at.
Yeah, it's very depressing times in Knicks Nation. And once again, you can write your questions into the comments section, no matter what platform you're watching on. We'll get to them throughout the show. But Ian, last week, on the Putback, ESPN's Brian Windhorst said that Ben Simmons would love to play for the Knicks. And since that statement, there's been some talk of Simmons in the Knicks. And you actually wrote an article for SNY.tv about it. What would it take to bring Simmons to NYC?
It would be complicated, I think, Chris, because you're not talking about the Knicks and the Sixers dealing directly in this kind of a transaction, because Philadelphia is looking for a top 20 player in return. Do they see Julius Randle as that kind of player that fits them, I'm not sure. So I think more likely it would be a 3-team deal, which gets very complicated, where the Knicks are sending out assets to a team. That team is sending that quote unquote top 20 player to Philly, and then Philly sends Ben Simmons to New York. Just seems unlikely at this point. And I think if you're Philly, you certainly want a resolution here, but do you really want to move Ben Simmons to New York where you're going to have to see him 4 times a year? I don't know. It seems far-fetched, but I do know that, he is among the players that the Knicks are kind of keeping an eye on as we approach trade season here.
So, Steve, do you think the Knicks should be willing to spend prospects and picks on Ben Simmons, considering, how his tenure has really soured in Philly, or do you think they should wait, for another player?
Well, I guess you're buying a little bit low on him, and everybody that the Knicks are sending out is low right now too. The complicated thing here is, look, for all the talk about Lillard and all these other guys that we talk about, star talents, Simmons might be the best fit, because when the Knicks are at their best, I think Julius Randle is the ball dominant guy. If you bring in another point guard who needs the ball in his hands, we saw already that didn't work with Kemba Walker. Simmons seems to be a fit. Look, he's a great defensive player. He's a good playmaker. There were some issues that, came up in the playoffs last year, and I don't think anything he's done this year has resolved any of those issues that people have about attitude or question marks. I think he'd be a great fit, but I think Daryl Morey would start with Julius Randle and wonder, what you have to add to it. But I think you need Julius Randle here to make him work.
So, Jonathan, do you think Julius would be able to stay in New York, if a deal were to happen where Simmons comes over, or do you think that's, not likely?
I mean, as Ian just talked about, it seems, Daryl Morey doesn't seem like a guy who beats around the bush. He's acknowledged pretty widely he needs a certain caliber of player to make it work. And, 3-team deals are tough in the middle of the season. As an aside, like, even if there was a way for the Knicks to divert that type of player from another team to Philly and then take back Simmons, at this point, are you willing, if you're New York, to give up that much in a transaction where, okay, what are you bringing Simmons back to? And this is, I feel like we've had this conversation a lot as people who talk about this team over the years. You need that stable base, which, again, I'll reference the young players. There's definitely a base of assets growing here, but are any one of those assets germane enough at this point to be, the centerpiece to a trade where, again, in some way, shape, or form, Simmons comes back, but Randle stays? I don't know about that.
Yeah. And, Steve, you brought up Damon Lillard, and he seems to be another one of those non-Knicks who comes up a lot on the putback. Before we get into the actual proposals, though, Ian, is it possible that the shakeups in Portland have impacted Dame's future with the Blazers? Because I feel like there's always articles that are about, dysfunction, whether it's Chauncey Billups, CJ McCollum, or Dame. It's just drama all over there in Portland.
Hey,
I think that you look at the situation over there, you look at what Joe Cronin has said. He said that he wants to try to build around Damian Lillard. Now, is that just posturing? Is he just trying to kind of confuse the market a little bit around Damian Lillard? I'm not sure. I know teams are going to continue to monitor that situation until it fully resolves itself, which means until they hire the next top basketball operations person, and that person decides what they want to do with Lillard and the roster. The interesting thing in Portland too is, I think the Knicks last year at least had kind of kicked the tires on CJ McCollum, just seeing how he might fit. We talked about it internally. I know Stephen Bondi, I think, reported that, and that's true. So I wonder if there's a pathway there to McCollum, because I think he's more likely to be moved right now than Damian Lillard. But I think everybody's kind of taking a wait and see approach to see if Cronin actually wants to try to build around Lillard and enhance that roster, or if they're going to wait for the next guy to take over and then maybe make the bigger move and tear it down.
Yeah, it's going to be very, very interesting to see how that situation resolves itself, if it ever does resolve itself. But John, in Ian's article for SNY, that TV gave 3 proposals, right? So all 3 of them involve RJ Barrett. All 3 involve 3 first-round picks. The first involves Obi Toppin and some other players. The second involves Emmanuel Quickley and more players. And the third involves both Quickley and Toppin and less extra players. So can you swallow the Knicks going through with any of these possible scenarios? You're like, yeah, full stop. We're not No Obi Toppin, not getting him. Definitely ain't getting Emmanuel quickly.
Hey,
John,
let me jump in just for one
please.
second, because I think this was perceived by some Twitter users as me like putting together or proposing trades that I would do for Damon. First of all, I would never do that. I don't do that. But people, I guess the way it was presented, they thought that I was concocting some packages, and I was not doing that. I was just looking at the way the math would work and the package of young guys I think the Knicks would need to give up for Lillard. But I'm not advocating or denying the idea of potential trades. That's not my thing. I did get crushed on Twitter for it, so that was fun.
Ian, how dare you say that things could ever be misperceived on Twitter or social media? Next time will be the first. I mean, here's the thing. If you had asked me this over the summer, I probably could have talked myself into it, because you're coming off of a year where Julius Randle, I mean, say what you want about it, finished second team All-NBA, 8th in MVP. And then was there a way to also, reserve some cap room to bring in, whether it's DeMar DeRozan, Lonzo Ball, someone to be that kind of third piece. Now, I don't see a world where it could possibly make any sense, because, as an NBA organization, you only get one of these types of swings per, cycle as your franchise. And we see the teams that have made these deals over the years. It's Brooklyn making the Harden deal. It's the Lakers making the AD deal. It's the Clippers making the Paul George deal. And even if you want to throw in Milwaukee making the Drew Holiday deal, in every one of those situations, those teams were a piece away from winning a championship. And sure enough, in the case of the Lakers and the Bucks, they actually did win a championship. The Clippers have, they've been right there. And obviously Kawhi's been hurt. And I mean, the Nets, are they the favorites this year? And they also had top end talent to add that second player to, whether it was Giannis or LeBron or Kevin Durant, or Kawhi Leonard, because it was kind of a combo deal with Paul George. The Knicks don't have that. The Knicks have right now a struggling version of Julius Randle, who, is he a top 50 NBA player? I don't really even know the answer to that. So it's not the time. If there was a situation where, the Blazers kept struggling for whatever reason, nothing happened in Philly. And, I don't think the Blazers were ever going to sell low on Dame. But if it was, maybe just the young players and a pick, or mostly picks and like one like lesser young player, I think you at least have a meeting, right? As the Knicks. But even then, it just seems it would be like a desperation swing at the wrong time and where your organization's at.
Yeah, absolutely. And Steve, somebody on YouTube is saying trade for De'Aaron Fox. That's the real resolution. This roster is so limited, especially on the perimeter. Do you agree with that? Would you do that?
Look, obviously they need talent. They're not, an elite team right now. And kind of the worst thing to be is where they are right now in the middle, that they're not a championship contender. They're not a team that's going to get a number one pick. To me, you have to decide what you are. I think Tom Thibodeau is kind of realistic and knew what they were last year, what they had to become. What they are this year, to me, these trades that you talk about, like Damian Lillard, there's another rule in the NBA. The deals you hear about are never the ones that happen. To me, when you're talking about who the Knicks have to package, I think, look, they're going to look to move Kemba, obviously. They're going to look to maybe move Mitchell Robinson with an expiring contract that they can't match teams on, can't pay him more than other teams. To me, those are the pieces. So you start thinking of like second tier guys. Yeah, Kevin Knox, sure. And you start adding up the money, but when you talk about adding the money like Ian did, the other team is going to be like, yeah, we're matching salaries, but we're not matching talent. Right. And even Damon Lillard, to me, like, he's had better talent than the Knicks have around here. Whatever they're going to give up, he's going to wind up with a worse team here than he's had in Portland. There's no title for him there. So does he make you a title contender here if you have to trade RJ Barrett or Julius Randle, and sell your future down the road? To me, that's why I think it's more, we're going to look at like a middle of the road type talent, get rid of some of these deals and try and capture the chemistry back and continue to start building through the draft.
Yeah.
Myles Turner.
Yeah.
I'm keeping an eye on.
Yeah, that is the guy. And we were out in Indiana last week, and he was very open about that they told him they're shopping him, and he was open that he wants a better situation. I had heard from people in the offseason, and I'm betting Ian has heard this too, that he would have liked to land in New York last summer if the deal could have been made. I think he likes the idea of being here. To me, he's a guy that I think you could see fitting. And I think those pieces that they've got to move, if you start attaching picks for the Pacers or something, maybe you can make it happen.
Okay, so going off of that, Ian, Mitchell Robinson probably seems like a smart fit in that deal, for Myles. But what else would you think the Knicks would need to give up in order to acquire him?
Yeah, listen, Myles Turner is a strong player in this league. He's proven that he can block shots. He can knock down the three-point shot. So he's not going to come cheap. And I think if the Pacers are making him available in an aggressive way, plenty of teams are going to be interested. So if you're the Knicks, I think you're going to have to end up giving up something of significance to get him, even though he's going to be a free agent in 2023. So in my mind, it's one of the three centers, Mitchell Robinson, I would say most likely. And then I think it's one of Obi Toppin or Emmanuel Quickley, assuming you're not going to put RJ Barrett in that deal. Maybe you would. I really think it's got to be one of those two, unless you're talking about Barrett. But either way, I think you have to be committed to giving up one of the young pieces in your quote unquote core, unless you want to go crazy with the draft compensation and make it worth Indiana's while that way, and then make the math work by sending in one of the veterans you signed to a short-term deal in the offseason. But to me, I don't think Indiana's going to engage with you unless you're giving up one of those players on rookie deals.
And you got to remember, Mitch is on an expiring contract, who's going to be a free agent at the end of the summer. So his value is there's a little bit less there. So I agree with Ian that you've got to think Obi, Emmanuel, maybe one of the rookies from this year, start putting pieces together that the Pacers can look to build around.
Yeah, which would be so hard, for Knicks fans to, give up because they love IQ and Toppin so much. Jonathan, are you comfortable with the Knicks giving up either of those young guys?
Well, no, I'm not. I'm not comfortable with it because, again, in a season that's been really kind of rough, those have been two of the 4 or 5 consistent bright spots. And, Obi Toppin, I think, especially with how much he's grown. And again, we're not talking about, potential like, well, what if the Knicks ever decided to move on from Julius Randle down the line? Where does Obi Toppin fit in the puzzle there? If he's, instead of getting 15 minutes a night, he's getting 30 minutes a night, how does he look then playing off of some dynamic guards? That said, this team, to me, it's very, aside from the obvious fit issues with Fournier and Kemba and those things, the center position has just not been up to par. And if you look at Thibodeau teams historically, you need an above average, a near elite defensive center to make the whole thing work. It worked last year. This season, Mitch, whether it's the weight gain or other injuries, Noel hasn't seemed right, although he looked good last night. And the whole thing is kind of falling apart on defense. Turner would fix a lot of that. And I do think the 3-point shot would help open up the floor for Julius. I think the question the front office has to ask themselves is there something here, really worth putting in a serious investment to rescue? Or do we kind of kick the can down the road a little bit? The thing I'd be looking for if I was the Knicks, the 2023 draft right now, they have, I believe, 4 second-round picks that are probably going to be coming to them. And assuming the Hornets first-round pick that they traded for on draft night doesn't convey this year, which it probably won't, they may have 3 first-rounders, the Dallas pick, the Hornets pick, and their own pick. That's a lot of draft assets to have in one year. My co-host on the Knicks Film Skool podcast, Jeremy Cohen, talked about this week, to potentially consolidate some of those draft assets and try to, steal Myles Turner using maybe a Rokas Jokubaitis who's playing overseas. Can they do that and then match the salaries? As Ian implies, there's going to be a lot of probably teams at least kicking the tires on Turner. I think that the market will dictate, what that deal is going to look like. If I was the Knicks, that's what I would be hoping for.
And it's interesting because you look at last year's team, and I think they were 12-15 at one point, which is what the Knicks were last season. So, we're talking about all these big changes, and I wonder if the opportunity is there for this group to kind of get it together in a way that we saw last year's group do. Now, I think obviously with last year's group, Derrick Rose, bringing him in via trade was one of the big catalysts. I know they started to win games a little bit before that, but Rose really, really turned the ship for them. And I just wonder if the internal development there or the cohesion there can come together in a way that it hasn't to this point. And should people be a little bit more patient rather than talking about the big swing? I know that doesn't happen a lot in New York. Patience is not something that is in abundance around here, but I just wonder, just big picture, should the team be patient? Should everybody relax and just see how this thing plays out?
I'm gonna no.
No.
Well, kind of because look, I think Ian, any of us, nobody predicted that they were going to be even what they were last year. I think we all saw last year they took advantage of a situation better than most teams. They didn't get harmed by COVID. They never had two guys out at once, never had to shut down practices. And they came prepared every night in a way that other teams didn't. In empty arenas, they brought the energy every night. This year, I think, like, I predict them for 43 wins and like be battling for a play-in spot. And I think that's the high end for this group right now.
Yeah, which is sad, but it just speaks to how hard it is, to repeat the same types of success, especially when you change the structure of the lineup and you put more offense on, but you lose more defense, giving up Reggie Bullock as well. And Ian, you turns out so much content here at SNY, basically had to give him a second show. Ian has a new recurring mailbag segment that is up on SNY.TV where he answers your questions about Knicks basketball, all while doing it with his backwards hat, which is always cool to see. Didn't bring it here today, so everybody on the panel is very disappointed. So next time we have a live show, Ian, you need to have that backwards hat on. It is must-see TV, but be sure to check that out right now on SNY.TV. And last night, Mark Berman, another member of the Beat Reporter Circle, praised the Knicks for not congratulating Steph Curry after breaking the all-time three-point record. But Steve, you had a problem with that. You care to explain?
I have a problem with a lot of things Mark says, but to me, look, I covered the Riley Knicks. I'm old, and I covered the Van Gundy Knicks, and I know that's an attitude thing. But look, I watched Giannis the other day. I think he fouled Nerlens Noel, and he immediately helps him up. And nobody plays harder than Giannis. To me, like, there was a special moment. Steph Curry is a likable player by everybody in the league, including some of these Knicks. To me, like, it's a stoppage in play to go over and just give him a pat on the back or fist bump and say, congrats, man. To me, that's not a big deal. People, the people who took Mark's side on Twitter were saying, worry about winning the game, congratulate him later. Well, you didn't win the game. You're not as good as the Warriors. To me, you can have class and you can still play hard.
I'm gonna call Steve participation trophy popper, because that's brutal, man. Like, why in the middle of a game?
It was, but it's not like, I'm not saying during a play, like, hey, why don't you take another three? It was a stoppage in play. They called timeout. To me, they're having a huge ceremony. It basically was post game because it took about that long.
Yeah.
To me, it's showing class and playing the right way. I don't know.
You need a competitive edge. I totally disagree. I'm with Mark, and I would say that one of the great joys of my life has been being on a beat where you have Mark Berman and Steve Popper and Stephen Bondi and way back Frank Isola, Al Iannazzone, because the barbs that fly back and forth on press row and over text, they're always entertaining.
Ian sits between me and Mark, so he's the buffer.
That could be a podcast right there.
It really could, man.
I'd listen to that.
We need to see some of those texts, you know what I'm saying? Some of those conversations. All right, but Jonathan, let's play a little what if game. We always love to do that. What if the Knicks drafted Steph Curry? How much different would the past dozen years have been, or would they have been different at all?
Let me just first say before I answer this question, that over the last couple of years with the pandemic and like just the off season, I've solicited like a lot of what ifs from fans to write about for my newsletter. And not once have I ever been asked this question. And that's because I hate this question. And most fans hate this question because it wasn't up to the Knicks, right? I think David Kahn, who had apparently a funny exchange with Yaron Weitzman when Yaron asked for his thoughts on Steph. Talk to the guy who passed on him twice or any of the teams above that. Like the Knicks didn't have that opportunity. Was there a deal to be made? Who knows? But I'm pretty sure, Steph and his camp made it very clear we don't want to play for the Warriors. They didn't care. They took him anyway. the rest is history. If he had gone to the Knicks, I mean, if I'm being honest, the Knicks have been poorly run for a lot of the time that Steph Curry has been in the league. He also started, I mean, part of the reason for the Warriors dynasty is because he had those initial ankle issues that he signed what I think essentially has to be considered the most below market NBA extension in modern history. I think it was like 4 years, $44 million. Mm-hmm. Would the Knicks have made a panic trade? Like we could sit here and we could speculate, okay, it's Steph, it's the city, would it have changed 2010? Who maybe would have come here? I think if Steph had remained here for the entirety of career, would we be talking about a Knicks championship at some point? Sure, because he's that good. But to know that he would have spent that entire time in a Knicks uniform, I wish I could say like, yeah, definitely it would have happened. We don't know.
John, it's such a good point when you talk about patience, because that's something I'm always kind of wondering about with the Knicks. And I think it applies to this group here because, Leon Rose, Tom Thibodeau, I think initially you saw them take that kind of long-term approach in that first offseason and even last offseason. They haven't taken their big swing yet, but that 41 win season last year, did that change the expectations at all internally to the point where maybe now the Knicks feel like they have to make a significant move to boost themselves in the standings, not only this year, but in the hierarchy of the Eastern Conference, because there's an urgency to try to win immediately, if not immediately, like be better and then continue this path forward? Are they worried about the backslide after a 41 win season and how that looks? And does that impact their thinking? I don't think it should, but I think it's inevitable that in some way it'll factor into what they do at the trade deadline and in the offseason.
And I think that those guys, the front office, it's easy to kick them right now. I don't think they've gotten the guys they wanted. I don't think they even got to sit down with some of the guys they wanted, which is a long running problem here in New York, for a place that everybody calls the Mecca. But I think these contracts that they signed that look terrible right now, Kemba and Fournier, the word wasn't great on these guys in the summer, but I will say this, they are not, overbearing contracts that you can't move. Somebody may take a flyer on Kemba. This is a guy who's been let go, or moved twice already, bought out, but it's a cheap deal. Can you add him in a deal for a team that needs a point guard right now that thinks they're a contender? I think probably can. Does somebody still believe in Fournier enough? Maybe. I don't know. It's not, it's not a $30 million a year contract. To me, these are deals that you might be able to move, and again, right now is not the time. They're at all-time lows. Although Ian and I were talking at the game last night, boy, it sure feels like they have to have something in the works for Kemba, because it just makes no sense that you don't see him on the floor on a night like last night.
And I'll just throw in quickly. I think, the front office certainly deserves some blame because, I mean, look, it's the new pieces they brought in didn't work. I also think they don't not deserve praise, but I think if you look at how they, as Steve, you were just mentioning, if you look at how they went about this offseason, and I would describe it as pretty measured all in all. I mean, I know they gave, Fournier a third guaranteed year, makes moving that money maybe a little bit more complicated. But I think the way they acted this offseason, to me at least, I hope, is indicative of they kind of knew this was still not the time to go all in. Now, was there even a place to go all in? That's a separate conversation, and we don't know that. But I'm with you, Ian. I hope that they continue to kind of take a slow and steady approach and do, as a former Knicks executive used to say, build this thing the right way.
Yes. It takes time, and as much as people want results immediately, especially in this age of social media where you get everything on your phone, championship teams are not born in year one or year two, so you have to let the cookie bake, as one of my friends says. But Ian, Kyrie Irving, this guy, he continues to be sideline Brooklyn because of the vaccine or not wanting to take the vaccine. But you reported that the Mavericks could be interested in the Nets polarizing point guard. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, the Nets and the Mavericks touch base recently, and the Mavericks, I know that Kristaps Porzingis' name came up. I know Kyrie Irving's name came up, and then subsequently to my report, Mark Cuban denied that they had interest in Kyrie to Mark Stein, but I circled back with the people I talked to on that one. I'm going to stand by my reporting on that one. I think the Mavericks, did talk to the Nets about Kyrie Irving. Did the talks reach advanced stages? I'm not sure. I don't think so. But, the idea that teams are calling about Kyrie Irving, the Nets are going to have to make a decision here, and it's not an easy one. How do you play this out? Do you hope that the mandate changes? Do you hope that Kyrie changes his mind? Does Joe Tsai change his mind? Like, how does this play out this year? Because you have the opportunity to win a title, and you have to take advantage of that Kevin Durant window that you have.
Yeah, he's Kevin Durant, obviously one of the greatest scorers ever. So you definitely want to maximize the time that you have him. But that's going to do it for this week's edition of the Putback with Ian Begley. Our thanks to Steve Popper. Be sure to keep reading his content in Newsday and on Newsday.com. And our thanks to Jonathan Macri. Listen to him on Knicks Film Skool podcast. We're back to our classic format next Wednesday. The episode will drop at 4 p.m. on SNY.TV and across our social platforms. For Ian Begley, I'm Chris Williamson. We'll see you next week.